I just finished rereading Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Now, this is a book that I have already reviewed on this channel. I read it. I read it kind of about 10 years ago. I say kind of because I did it as an audiobook 10 years ago. But I did the audiobook 10 years ago. I reviewed it on my blog at the time. And then, I don't know, a couple years ago or something like that, I used that old blog post I had written as a basis for making a YouTube video, part of what I call my scripted review series, in which I just read out my old weblog reviews and try to make them into YouTube videos. So, I've now reread it, and I'd like to try to make a video out of the reread. Going forward, I'd like to do more rereading on this channel. At least that's my ambition. And I'd like to try and make videos when I do a reread and talk about the things that I noticed on the second reading. At least that's the idea. You can maybe hear a little bit of hesitation in my voice because I really don't have much intelligent to say about this book after rereading it. My impressions of this book 10 years ago are fairly close to my impressions now. So what I'd like to do is, well, what I usually do on this channel is just ramble. So I'm going to ramble for the next 30 minutes, talk about all the thoughts I have connected with this book. Maybe it will turn out to be of some interest, possibly, maybe not. No one is obligated to watch this video. I mean, you know, if you want to just stop watching here, we are still friends. But that being said, that warning out of the way, I'm going to go through and just talk about the reading experience. So I made a started video earlier this week, which I'll link to in the description down below, in which I talked about why I was picking up this book again. The main reason is because I had never read the sequel, Through the Looking Glass. So I thought, okay, well, I'll reread the first book and then go on to Through the Looking Glass. This edition I have here has a publisher's introduction by Morton N. Cohen, which was interesting. It talked about how this story shaped in Lewis Carroll's mind. It turns out Lewis Carroll isn't even his name. It was, what was it? Charles Dodgson. Lewis Carroll is just his pen name. So it's a story he told to entertain three girls he was going on a picnic with. They were rowing down the river. One of whom was named Alice. Then Alice wanted him to write the story down, which he did as like a present for her. But then several other people were interested in it, and so he got the idea to attempt to publish it. He was a mathematics professor, I believe, or mathematics don or something like that. He was teaching mathematics. So this was his first foray into the publishing world. He was not like a big literary name. So he had to shop his manuscript around to publishing houses who had no idea who he was, or very, very little idea who he was. He got some letters of introduction from friends. So, you know, all of that was interesting because something like Alice in Wonderland, at least I tend to just think of it as a classic book that's always been there. So it's interesting to hear how it came to be and how the author was somebody who was not powerful in the publishing world and was nervous about whether or not it could get published. And then it talks about how it got illustrated by a guy named John Tennell. who was famous at the time. Tennell apparently was already a famous illustrator at the time. At least that's what they said in this publisher's introduction. Worked on that Punch magazine, which was famous at the time, I think, as well as some other stuff. And I didn't realize, maybe, that the illustrations in Alice in Wonderland go back to the original edition. Yeah, I mean, I really actually, I've got to confess, I don't know anything about how printing works. You know, like, how did they print all this in the 19th century before, you know, electronic computers? I guess they were wood blocks, but yeah, it's just interesting to see all these illustrations, and that they go back to 1862. Was that when this book was published? Yeah, and then the introduction goes on to talk about how Through the Looking Glass was published, and Through the Looking Glass was also illustrated by the same guy. Although he did not want to illustrate Through the Looking Glass because he was way too busy. But Lewis Carroll, or Charles Dodgson, couldn't find anyone else he was happy with. So Through the Looking Glass they delayed the publication until he could get free time in his schedule to do the illustrations. And I've got to say, as somebody who did the audiobook the first time, boy, that was a mistake to do the audiobook. I'm glad I've actually read this now and looked at the pictures, because the pictures really make it. And so much so that occasionally even the narrator will rely on the pictures. A few examples of this. The famous scene of the cards painting the roses red, huh? Now, in the actual text itself, it's not really clear that these are playing cards. I mean, there's some hints, but just, you know, if you had never seen any of the movies or cartoons and weren't aware of this book at all, just based on the narration itself without words, the description of them as playing cards, it's not. There are hints of it, but it never really says they are playing cards. Yeah, what does it say exactly? Sorry. Yeah, so a large rose tree stood near the entrance of the garden. The roses growing on it were white, but there were 3 gardeners at it, busily painting them red. So it describes them as 3 gardeners. It doesn't say they're playing cards. Now, there are little hints later. I think it talks about them having small hands or something like that. And of course, they refer to themselves by like 2, 5, and 7. Yeah, it's not. I think it's not until the Queen's guards come that. Yeah. They were all shaped like the 3 gardeners, oblong and flat, with their hands and feet at the corners. Oblong and flat with their hands and feet at the corners. So it doesn't really explicitly say they're playing cards, but although later I think Alice does say to them, "Oh, who cares for you? You're all just a bunch of cards." But that's much, you know, that's it's like 40 pages later. Yeah, so that's one way where the actual the narration is heavily dependent on the pictures. And then when we get to a griffin, it says, if you don't know what a griffin is, you can look at the picture above, which maybe is a little bit lazy narration, I don't know. But so that the picture interacts with the text in that way. And then later when it talks about how the king is wearing a wig sorry, so the king is acting as a judge. So he's got on his judge's wig, and then he's got the crown over the wig. And it says something like, what does it say? It says, the judge, by the way, was the king, and as he wore his crown over the wig, look at the front piece if you want to see how he did it. He did not look at all comfortable and was certainly not becoming. Now the problem with that, in my edition at least, is that that piece of text is here, and then there's no picture of the king with his headpiece on until all the way over here. So this is obviously a relatively cheap reprint. So I'm not sure. In different editions, I imagine that's arranged differently. Anyway, sorry, I'm taking up a lot of time just to say that the illustrations are really good and that they add a lot to this. The other thing, there's another part where the mouse is telling his story, and I believe it's the mouse's tail. So the mouse is telling his tale, but Alice is looking at his tail. It's a typical pun, which is all throughout this book. But then you can see the mouse's tail like this, which is another thing that was completely lost in the audiobook. I'm assuming that there's some sort of similar typesetting in all editions. By the way, apologies for everything showing up in reverse image on this camera, but you get the idea, right? Speaking of puns, I think this is something I mentioned in my original review, but the review I filmed before. But yeah, there's so many puns and plays on words all throughout this book, which surprised me when I first read it 10 years ago because, as somebody who's been living abroad, I'm aware that this book is popular all over the world. It was very popular in Japan, in translation, which I remember from when I lived in Japan. But then you read this and you're like, how could they possibly have translated this book? I mean, the whole thing is based on all these puns and wordplay and stuff like that. I don't know. I'd be curious to look at the Japanese translation now. My Japanese isn't good enough to actually read it, but yeah. Anyways, I'm going to repeat myself slightly from my first review, but I guess maybe I should talk about the main problem I have with this book. And it's something that has carried over with me from childhood. Now, I actually never read this book as a child, but it's one of those books that's so popular in the culture that you see the movies. I think when I was at school, we saw a stage play based on it. There was a comic book based on it, Fisher-Price classic series that we had at our house, comic book with a cassette. So even though I never actually read Lewis Carroll's original text, Charles Dodgson's original text, I knew the story. And the thing that I never really liked about the story is it's one of those stories where everything's a dream. Actually, that's another interesting point I got from the publisher's introduction. Somewhere in here it talks about how the Lewis Carroll, Charles Dodgson, was developing the story, and he says it's all a dream, but that part's going to be kept secret until the end. And I'm thinking, well, it's not that much of a secret, right? I mean, you as you're reading through this, I don't know. It also made me wonder. I've always had a dislike of stories that turn out to be all a dream. makes me feel like, oh, well, what was I just listening to that story then? You know, like there's nothing more boring than listening to someone's dream. Now, I know you could say, okay, well, I mean, but all literature is just imagination. You know, like Treasure Island didn't really happen either. I know, but when you read Treasure Island, you are imagining that it really happened, if that makes sense. When you read something like Treasure Island, even though you know that it's purely fictitious, for the time that you are reading it, you are transported into a world in which there are stakes, in which what the characters do matters, and where it feels like a real world to you, and you buy into this idea that this is a real world for the time that you are engaged with that book. To then, at the end of the story, say, and then he woke up and it was all a dream, just makes me feel like the investment I had put into that was wasted if it turns out, even within the world of the book, that it was just somebody's dream. And, you know, there's nothing more boring than listen to a friend tell you about their dreams or something like that. In addition to that, I mean, we don't really find out it's a dream until the end, but it's obviously a fantasy world in which there is no geography to speak of. So, for example, Alice is trapped in this room. She wants to get through the door, and she's doing this thing with the cakes where she eats one and it makes her bigger and eats one that makes her smaller. There's a door leading out to a garden that she can see, but she can't quite get to the right size and she can't quite get the key. Then she starts crying and creates a sea of salt water from her tears. Then she shrinks down to a small size. And then all of a sudden she's in the ocean, and then there's a mouse. Sorry, not ocean. Sea, I guess. And then all the creatures from that little sea who hadn't been there before, but all of a sudden there are all these creatures now are showing up, and they're doing all this stuff. And then she goes off, and all of a sudden there's a house, and you're like, well, what happened to the room that she was stuck in? Like the physical surroundings of her are fading in and out, where she'll be in a room and then she won't be in that room, and she'll be there's no, you know, like in the Wizard of Oz, even though that's a completely ridiculous story as well, there is at least a geography where they're going from point A to point B, and there's just none of that in Alice in Wonderland, nor are there really any stakes. You know, she encounters all these weird creatures, but it's very obvious that she's never really in any danger. She rarely, I mean, even in situations where she would be in danger, she really evidences that she's in danger. She's got a very analytical attitude to how silly the creatures are being, rather than being really worried about anything. So it's a world in which it's all a dream, in which there's no geography or reality. Things just kind of seem to fade in and fade out, in which there are no stakes. So that was the reason I was not interested in this book as a kid, and it's something which puts me off a little bit even as an adult. On the plus side, though, well, there are a number of things to be said on the plus side. First of all, there are a lot of funny parts. So just reading it for the humor could be one reason to read it. Now the humor is mixed up with the other stuff. Like there are. It's not like a laugh riot, but there are definitely some funny parts. The wordplay, and then I don't know. I'm kind of wondering. You can see in this video I'm having a conversation with myself to a certain extent. But I'm wondering if this is one of those books that's a little bit spoiled simply by just being overexposed. Because it was interesting to read the publisher's introduction. And they were talking in the publisher's introduction about how popular this book was when it was first published. The publishers were not expecting it. But it just went from like nobody ever heard of this guy Lewis Carroll to people were just loving this book, and people, his friends said, I got your copy of the book this morning and I just stayed in bed all morning reading it. I didn't want to put it down. And I think nowadays anyone who picks up this book already knows. You already know about the Mad Hatter. You already know about the March Hare. You've already seen the movies. You already know about the Queen of Hearts. So some parts of it, like for example here, this caterpillar sitting on a mushroom, smoking a hookah, made me think, that is quite an interesting image, isn't it? And I don't think I ever appreciated it as a kid just because I was so sick of this story. It's one of those things that maybe you can imagine how when people first read this story, these images, these ridiculous images, made an impression on them. That is not quite as strong for audiences nowadays, readers nowadays, because we've all seen the Disney movie before we even open up the book. Yeah, I don't know. Speaking of the Disney movie, the Disney movie does mix in some stuff with Through the Looking Glass. So Tweedledee and Tweedledum, I think, are Through the Looking Glass. The Walrus and the Carpenter, I believe, is also Through the Looking Glass. I've not read that Through the Looking Glass yet, but I'm just going off of like Wikipedia and stuff. But a lot of the stuff that's in here does actually follow the Disney movie pretty close, closer than I expected. And I say closer than I expected because, those Disney movies are not famous for being faithful to their source material. But a number of the scenes in here were actually seem to be fairly close to how I remembered it from the Disney movie. Like, Alice getting stuck in the house, the lizard having to go down the chimney to get Alice out, and then getting shot out of the chimney and going flying up into the sky. Just like it was in the Disney movie. The Queen of Hearts, very similar to the Disney movie. The cards who are painting the white roses red and all that stuff. Oh yeah, another interesting thing I picked up from the publisher's introduction is apparently when Lewis Carroll first wrote this story just for Alice and for his friends, it wasn't long enough to be published. So he had to add stuff into it to get it published. Because I read the introduction before I reread this, all throughout when I'm reading this, I'm like, okay, where's the filler? Where's the stuff that just got added in to help make this longer to be published? one of the things I wonder, because they meet the Queen of Hearts, and there's all this stuff with the Queen of Hearts, and then the Queen of Hearts says to her, you have to go hear the Mock Turtle story. So then the Queen of Hearts leaves her with the Griffin, and the Griffin takes her to meet the Mock Turtle, and then she has to meet the Mock Turtle, and then the Mock Turtle story goes on for several pages. Sorry, I was going to say several chapters, but it's only 2 chapters. Yep, 2 chapters. And then just going back to the Queen and King of Hearts and the shenanigans at their court, makes me wonder if the Mock Turtle and the Griffin part was part of the filler. I don't know. That information is probably out there somewhere, huh? Yeah, there's... sorry, I'm looking up at the time because I think the timer on this camera, I've only got enough memory to film for about 27 minutes, and I'm almost there. So, you know what? Maybe I'll just finish up there. I think I could ramble on longer if I had more time, but there's no reason I have to. So, yeah, I'll just stop the video here. So, sorry about all the pausing and hesitations and rambling. I don't know if this video has ended up being useful to anyone, but here we are.